Good day. Today, we journey back to one of the darkest periods in human history, a time when death became so commonplace that the living could scarcely keep pace with burying the dead. We are speaking of the Black Death, the bubonic plague that swept across Europe between 1347 and 1353. This was not merely a disease, it was a cataclysm that fundamentally transformed medieval civilization. When we think of devastating pandemics, modern examples come to mind. Yet nothing in recent history compares to the Black Death. In the span of just 7 years, between 30 and 60% of Europe's population perished. Some estimates suggest that as many as 75 to 200 million people died across Eurasia. The survivors looked upon a world that had been utterly changed. Families were obliterated. Cities were emptied. Entire villages ceased to exist. The Black Death was not the work of a foreign invader, nor was it a famine or war. It was something far more terrifying and inscrutable to medieval minds, a microscopic bacterium traveling on the backs of fleas that lived upon rats. The bacterium was called Yersinia pestis, though no one in the 14th century knew of its existence. They knew only the terror of a disease that struck without warning and killed with pitiless efficiency. Over the next 40 minutes, we will explore the origins of this catastrophe, how it spread across the medieval world, how people attempted to cope with it, and what lasting consequences emerged in its wake. We will examine the science of the plague, the medical responses of the time, the social upheaval it caused, the religious fervor it ignited, and the new world that emerged once the worst had passed. Let us begin. The bubonic plague was not new to the world when it arrived in Europe in 1347. The disease had visited humanity before. The most famous earlier outbreak was the plague of Justinian in the 6th century, which killed tens of millions of people in the Byzantine Empire and surrounding regions. But that plague, despite its horror, had faded into historical memory. For nearly 8 centuries, Europe had been spared this particular torment. The origins of the Black Death that would ravage Europe lie deep in Central Asia. In 1338 and 1339, in what is now the nation of Kyrgyzstan, in the Tian Shan Mountains, the plague bacterium emerged and began its deadly work. Archaeologists have discovered tombstones in ancient cemeteries in that region, inscribed with dates indicating that in 1338 and 1339, numerous people died of an unspecified pestilence. DNA evidence extracted from the remains of these individuals revealed the presence of Yersinia pestis. This bacterium, which would eventually kill millions, is believed to have been carried by fleas living on black rats. These rats, also called house rats or ship rats, had the particular characteristic of living in close proximity to humans. They traveled in grain shipments, in the holds of merchant vessels, in the carts of traders, and among the clothing and belongings of merchants and soldiers. As trade expanded, particularly along the Silk Road, these infected rats spread the disease westward from Central Asia. Throughout the early 1300s, the plague gradually made its way across the Asian continent. In 1346, the disease reached the Crimean Peninsula, a vital trading hub where European merchants, particularly the Genoese, maintained outposts. At that time, the Crimean city of Kaffa was under siege by the Golden Horde, a Mongol army that had been ravaged by plague. According to some accounts, the Mongol commander Yani Beg, observing that his troops were dying of plague, resorted to a gruesome tactic. He ordered the infected corpses of plague victims to be catapulted over the city walls in an attempt to infect the defenders. Whether or not this legendary act of biological warfare actually occurred, what is certain is that the plague reached Kaffa and the Genoese merchants there. In 1347, desperate to escape the plague, the Genoese merchants loaded their ships and departed for home in the Mediterranean. But they carried with them the infected rats and fleas that had caused such devastation. They did not know it, of course. Knowledge of the germ theory of disease would not exist for another 500 years. But the rats and fleas were aboard their vessels nonetheless. In October 1347, the Genoese ships arrived at the port of Messina in Sicily. The sailors aboard were showing signs of illness. Fevers, swollen lymph nodes, the telltale dark patches on the skin. The disease that would become known as the Black Death had arrived in Europe. From Messina, the plague spread with terrifying speed. Within weeks, it had reached the Italian mainland. By November 1347, it had spread to Marseille in France. Throughout 1348, it moved inexorably northward and eastward. In Egypt, the great city of Cairo, with a population of perhaps 600,000, was struck. The plague killed so many that society nearly collapsed. One contemporary account reports that the Sultan himself fled the city in fear. In Europe, the plague spread along the same trade routes that had brought prosperity in earlier centuries. Venice, Genoa, Florence, Milan, and the other city-states that depended on Mediterranean commerce found themselves at the epicenter of the catastrophe. From the ports, the disease moved inland along rivers and roads. By 1348, major cities including Paris, London, and Barcelona were reporting plague cases. By 1349, the plague had reached northern England, Scotland, and Scandinavia. Within 2 years, it had spread to the remotest corners of Europe that maintained any contact with the trading world. What exactly was the Black Death? What symptoms did it cause? The name itself comes from one of the disease's most characteristic features, the appearance of dark or blackened skin as blood vessels burst and tissues died. But the most recognizable symptom was the appearance of buboes. These were swollen, painful lumps that appeared in the groin, armpit, and neck where the lymph nodes became grotesquely enlarged. These buboes would ooze pus and blood. Contemporary accounts describe them as the size of apples or eggs. For those who saw them, the buboes were unmistakable signs of doom. The plague progressed rapidly. Within 1 to 7 days of infection, flu-like symptoms would develop. The victim would experience a high fever, sometimes reaching 105 or 106 degrees Fahrenheit. Severe headaches followed. The person would experience nausea and vomiting. As the disease progressed, the vomit might contain blood. The victim might develop black pustules and boils on the skin. Violent coughing could commence. Pain shot through the joints and muscles. For some unknown reason, the extremities of the victim sometimes turned black, as if the flesh were dying while the person was still alive. Death came swiftly for most. Contemporary accounts reported that most victims died between 2 to 7 days after initial infection. Some sources claimed that 70% of those infected died within 5 days. As the disease progressed and transformed into its pneumonic form, where the bacterium infected the lungs, the death rate approached 100%. Those who contracted pneumonic plague had virtually no chance of survival. Medieval medicine was utterly powerless against this disease. The medical knowledge of the time was based on ancient authorities such as Hippocrates, Galen, and Aristotle. The dominant theory of disease was the concept of miasma, or bad air. Physicians believed that disease spread through foul odors and corrupt air that threw the body's 4 humors out of balance. These 4 humors were thought to be blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Health depended on maintaining these in proper proportion. Given this understanding, the treatments prescribed were misguided at best and lethal at worst. Some doctors prescribed bloodletting, opening the veins to drain what they saw as an excess of blood. Others gave purgatives designed to induce vomiting or diarrhea. These treatments merely weakened the patient further. Some physicians prepared theriac, an expensive and complex medicine made from the flesh of vipers, opium, and other ingredients. It was useless against the plague. One popular remedy was the 4 thieves vinegar, a mixture of cider, vinegar, or wine combined with spices such as sage, rosemary, clove, and wormwood. According to legend, 4 thieves had created this drink and used it as protection while robbing the homes and graves of plague victims without becoming infected themselves. The reality is that 4 thieves vinegar provided no protection whatsoever. Physicians themselves were often the first casualties of the plague. As the disease spread, many doctors fled their cities, abandoning their patients to their fate. Those who remained often lacked experience, being younger physicians forced to treat patients that experienced doctors had abandoned. By the late stages of the plague, many cities had no doctors at all. The only approach that actually worked was quarantine, though no one understood why it worked. The port city of Ragusa, in what is now Dubrovnik, Croatia, noticed that plague victims were infectious and that people could catch the disease from the ill. In response, they instituted a 30-day isolation period for all arriving ships. This quarantine period was later extended to 40 days, from which comes our modern word quarantine, from the Italian 40 giorni, meaning 40 days. Some cities attempted to protect their physicians by constructing pest holes or plague houses outside the city walls where victims would be isolated. By the late 14th century, physicians treating plague victims adopted protective gear, including long gowns, hats, and the famous beaked masks filled with aromatic substances. Ironically, although the reasoning behind this protective gear was based on the flawed miasma theory, the outfit did provide some degree of protection against blood and respiratory droplets. But these measures could not stop the plague. The sheer speed of its transmission overwhelmed all attempts to contain it. The invisible enemy traveled with the fleas, in the rats, in the clothing of the merchant, in the cargo holds of ships. Death moved faster than understanding. The death tolls were staggering. In Florence, one of Europe's greatest cities, the population collapsed from approximately 110 to 120,000 in 1338 to just 50,000 by 1351. Some accounts suggest that 80% of the city's population died within 4 months in 1348 alone. Entire neighborhoods were emptied of life. In Paris, estimates suggest that half the population died. Contemporaries wrote that whole families were obliterated, with none remaining to inherit their property or continue their line. In London, the population fell from perhaps 100,000 to as few as 20,000. Hamburg and Bremen lost 60% or more of their inhabitants. Some smaller towns and villages were entirely depopulated. Travelers passing through these places would see only corpses and the empty shells of houses. Across all of Europe, scholars estimate a mortality rate of between 40 and 65%. Some suggest that approximately 50 million people perished, though exact numbers remain debated. The population of Europe, which had been steadily growing for centuries, was suddenly cut in half. What does this mean in human terms? Imagine an entire generation erased. Imagine walking through the streets of your city and finding 9 out of 10 houses empty. Imagine the constant sound of church bells tolling for the dead, until the bells simply ceased because no one was left to ring them. Imagine a mother burying her children, her husband, and her own parents within a span of weeks. This was the reality of the Black Death. The death and horror of the plague shattered the medieval worldview. People had been taught that life was stable, ordered according to God's divine plan. The Church promised that faith and prayer would provide salvation. Yet the prayers went unanswered. The pious died at the same rate as the wicked. Even priests and monks, supposedly blessed with God's protection, fell victim to the plague in vast numbers. In some monastery communities, the mortality was so complete that the institution ceased to exist. In response to this catastrophe, a desperate religious fervor seized Europe. People turned to what they thought was their only recourse: penitence and atonement. If the plague was God's punishment for humanity's sins, then perhaps suffering could appease God's wrath. One manifestation of this fervor was the flagellant movement. Beginning in 1348 in Austria, perhaps Hungary as well, groups of religious zealots began to roam from town to town, seeking to atone for the sins of humanity through extreme acts of self-torture. These flagellants, as they were called, wore robes and carried whips with which they beat themselves bloody in public processions. They would fall to the ground in frenzies of penitential agony, their blood streaking the streets. The flagellants were often greeted with enthusiasm by desperate populations. Here at last were people doing something, taking action to address the catastrophe. The flagellants were viewed by many as saints, as holy warriors fighting against divine wrath through their suffering. Some accounts claim that the flagellants were believed to possess miraculous powers, able to heal the sick and work wonders. But the flagellant movement took a dark turn. As the plague continued unabated despite their penance, the flagellants began to seek scapegoats for God's wrath. Jews became the primary targets of their fury. Jews were accused of poisoning Christian wells, of causing the plague through malevolent magic and conspiracy. These accusations were entirely false. Jews were dying of plague at the same rate as Christians. Yet the scapegoating fury was unstoppable. The flagellants led horrific massacres of Jewish communities across Europe. In Germany, Alsace, and elsewhere, thousands of Jews were slaughtered. Their homes were burned. Their property was seized. Some Jewish communities that had existed for centuries were entirely obliterated. The massacres were so severe that they are among the worst persecutions of Jews in medieval European history. Eventually, the Church itself grew alarmed at the flagellants' behavior, both because of their ultra-extremism and because of their anti-Semitic violence. In October 1349, Pope Clement VI issued a papal bull declaring the flagellants to be heretics. Cities and towns began barring them from entry. Many flagellants were arrested and executed. The movement, which had risen so dramatically, was suppressed within a few years. Beyond the flagellants, the religious response to the plague took many other forms. Penitential processions wound their way through cities, with believers fasting and praying for deliverance. People purchased amulets and charms inscribed with divine names, hoping for magical protection. Some attempted to protect themselves by fleeing infected cities, though this merely spread the plague to new areas. But alongside the religious fervor came something more profound, a crisis of faith. The Church had promised that prayer, faith, and penance would provide protection. Yet these things had utterly failed. Believers turned to God, and God seemed silent. The Church had also preached that the clergy were intermediaries between humanity and the divine. Yet priests and bishops died at the same rate as laypeople. Their supposed holiness provided no protection. This crisis of faith would have long-term consequences. The perceived failure of the Church to explain or control the plague contributed to a gradual decline in the Church's moral authority. Centuries later, this loss of authority would contribute to the conditions that led to the Protestant Reformation. The Black Death, though indirectly, helped plant the seeds that would eventually split Western Christianity. The social and economic consequences of the Black Death were equally transformative. Before the plague, European society had been rigidly organized according to feudalism. At the bottom were serfs, peasants bound to the land and owing service and payment to their lords. Above them were the lords and nobility who controlled the land. Above them were the kings and ultimately the Pope. This system depended on a large, stable population. Land was abundant but labor was scarce. Most peasants could not leave their land even if they wished to, because they owed service to their lords. The situation kept wages low and kept the social hierarchy stable. The plague destroyed this equilibrium. With half the population dead, suddenly labor became extraordinarily scarce, and land became abundant. Peasants who survived found themselves in an unprecedented position. Their labor was desperately needed, and they could command payment for it. More importantly, they could move. Surviving peasants could leave their lords' lands and move to towns or to the lands of other lords offering better terms. Alarmed at this disruption to the established order, the authorities took action. In England, the government enacted the Ordinance of Labourers in 1349 and the Statute of Labourers in 1351. These laws attempted to freeze wages at pre-plague levels and restrict workers' freedom of movement. Similar laws were promulgated across Europe. But these laws could not stem the underlying economic reality. Labor was scarce, and workers could command higher wages. However, the benefits to workers were partially offset by inflation. The plague had killed so much of the population that the amount of currency in circulation per capita actually increased. This sparked significant inflation in prices. Wages rose in nominal terms, but once inflation was accounted for, real wages actually declined in many places over time. Nevertheless, the labor shortage did lead to lasting changes in the relationship between workers and their employers. More fundamentally, the Black Death accelerated the decline of feudalism. The manorial system that had been the foundation of medieval society was already under strain before the plague. The plague assured its demise. With labor in short supply, peasants could no longer be held to their lords through lack of alternatives. Lords were forced to offer better terms, reduced rents, greater personal freedoms, and payment in wages rather than require service. Over the following centuries, serfdom gradually disappeared from Western Europe. By 1500, feudalism had become little more than a historical memory. This shift from feudal obligation to wage labor had enormous consequences. It contributed to the development of capitalism, where labor became a commodity bought and sold in markets. It contributed to the gradual emergence of a middle class of urban workers and merchants. And it fundamentally changed the relationship between those who worked the land and those who owned it. The plague also had significant effects on urban populations and city life. In the immediate aftermath of the plague, cities contracted dramatically. Florence shrank from over 100,000 to 50,000. Venice lost perhaps 35% of its population. Even London, after initially losing half its population, recovered somewhat. But cities gradually regained their populations. The surviving rural population migrated to cities in search of higher wages and better opportunities. Over time, cities expanded. However, cities that had certain advantages recovered faster. Cities that sat on important trade routes, had good harbors, or were centers of manufacture recovered more rapidly than those that did not. The plague had profound effects on the European economy more broadly. In the short term, it caused economic collapse. Trade routes were disrupted. Workshops and businesses closed because owners and workers had died. Markets and fairs ceased operation. The flow of commerce that had made cities wealthy came to a halt. But in the long term, some regions benefited from the plague. Paradoxically, northern Italy, particularly Venice and Genoa, which had been the initial point of entry for the plague, emerged as among the first and most vigorous centers of recovery. This was partly because these cities had advantages in trade that allowed them to recover quickly, and partly because their merchant classes had contacts throughout the Mediterranean and could resume profitable commerce relatively quickly. The plague also had effects on agriculture. With such a high mortality rate, many villages were abandoned. More than 1,300 villages in England alone were deserted between 1350 and 1500. The shortage of agricultural labor meant that large tracts of land fell out of cultivation. Some historians have suggested that this actually provided environmental benefits, allowing forests to regenerate and nature to recover from medieval agricultural exploitation. The plague transformed European art and literature. Artists and writers, traumatized by the experience of mass death, began to portray the world through a darker lens. The classical and religious idealism that had dominated medieval art gave way to a more realistic, sometimes grotesque depiction of human experience. One particularly famous artistic motif that emerged from the plague was the danse macabre, or dance of death. This artistic and literary theme depicted death as a personified figure, often a skeleton or a corpse, leading people from all walks of life, from popes and kings to peasants and beggars, in a dance toward the grave. The motif expressed the terrifying reality that death was universal, that no amount of wealth, status, or power could protect one from death's inevitable call. Artistic works such as The Triumph of Death, painted by Francesco Traini around 1350, portrayed death and destruction with a nightmarish quality. 7 different scenes depicted various aspects of plague and mortality. Figures seemed tortured, twisted in agony. The overall effect was apocalyptic and deeply unsettling. Writers too were transformed by the plague experience. The great authors of the 14th century, Petrarch, Boccaccio, Chaucer, and others, were either survivors of the plague or shaped by living in its aftermath. Boccaccio's Decameron, one of the most important literary works of the medieval period, frames the narrative within the context of the plague. The story begins as the plague devastates Florence, and young people flee the city to the countryside, where they spend 10 days telling stories to pass the time. The literature of the post-plague period tends to be more realistic and less idealistic than earlier medieval literature. Writers grappled with dark themes of mortality, the fragility of human life, and the vanity of earthly existence. The plague had shattered illusions about human progress and the stability of society. Writers reflected this new, harder understanding of reality. The plague also affected popular folklore and superstition. In Scandinavia and Northern Europe, the plague came to be personified as an ancient hag dressed in black, called the Pesta. Norwegians believed that when the Pesta passed through the land, if she carried a rake, some people might escape through the gaps in the rake's teeth. But if she carried a broom, sweeping it across the land, then everyone in the region was doomed. This folklore reflected the random and inexplicable nature of the plague's mortality. Beyond Europe, the plague had enormous impacts in the Islamic world and Asia. Cairo, as mentioned, lost over a third of its population. The disease ravaged Syria, Palestine, and the broader Islamic world. The Mamluk Sultanate of Egypt saw its military capacity severely reduced, affecting the balance of power in the Mediterranean. In Asia, the plague may have contributed to the weakening of the Mongol Empire, though this remains debated among historians. By the early 1350s, the worst of the plague had passed in Europe. The mortality rate slowed, though the disease did not disappear. Smaller outbreaks would recur sporadically for centuries. In fact, plague would resurge in subsequent waves, with another major outbreak in the 15th century. However, the catastrophic mortality of 1347 to 1353 was unique. The recovery that followed was slow and uneven. It took nearly 2 centuries for European population to return to pre-plague levels. Different regions recovered at different rates. Some areas recovered faster than others. Venice and northern Italy recovered relatively quickly, while some rural areas remained sparsely populated for generations. By the 16th century, Europe had largely recovered demographically. Population had returned to pre-plague levels and eventually surpassed them. The continent that emerged from the plague was different from the medieval continent that had been struck by it. The feudal system had been weakened irreparably. A new social and economic order was emerging. Cities had reasserted their importance. Trade networks had been reconstructed. In many ways, the recovery from the Black Death and the transformation it catalyzed contributed to the conditions that would lead to the European Renaissance of the 15th and 16th centuries. The relative prosperity, the growth of commerce, the new emphasis on realistic art and literature, the questioning of established authorities, all of these developments can be traced in part to the aftermath of the plague. What is perhaps most remarkable about the Black Death is how medieval people coped with it using the intellectual and medical frameworks available to them. They could not have imagined a microscopic bacterium or the concept of disease transmission through insect vectors. Yet they managed to survive, to maintain some social order, and eventually to recover. The plague taught some practical lessons. The quarantine measures instituted in ports like Ragusa worked, even though those instituting them did not understand why. Over time, some authorities began to recognize that isolation of the sick could prevent spread of disease. This knowledge, preserved and refined, would eventually contribute to modern public health practices. The plague also demonstrated the limits of medieval medicine and the importance of empirical observation. The grand medical theories based on ancient authorities had failed utterly. Only practical measures, quarantine and isolation, had proven effective. This experience, though it would take centuries to fully develop, contributed to the eventual emergence of scientific medicine. As we conclude our exploration of the Black Death, we must reflect on its historical significance. This was not merely a disease or a medical catastrophe. It was a transformative historical event that fundamentally altered the course of European civilization. It ended an era, the medieval world. It catalyzed the transition toward the early modern world. The plague killed perhaps 1/3 to 1/2 of Europe's population in the span of 7 years. Nothing in recent history compares to this scale of mortality as a proportion of population. Yet human civilization survived. The institutions that were shattered, feudalism, the unchallenged authority of the Church, gradually reformed into new patterns. The Black Death reminds us of the vulnerability of human civilization. For all our accomplishments, we remain subject to forces beyond our control. Disease, natural disaster, or other catastrophes can strike without warning and reshape the world in its aftermath. The survivors of the Black Death could not have imagined, as they buried their dead, that their descendants would thrive and eventually surpass the populations of their own time. Yet this is what occurred. The Black Death was a catastrophe, a tragedy of almost unimaginable proportions. Yet from this catastrophe, a new world emerged. The survivors and their descendants built institutions, created art and literature, established trade networks, and pursued knowledge. They did what humans seem to do: they endured, adapted, and moved forward. The medieval period had its own tragic grandeur. But it was the cataclysm of the Black Death that finally brought the medieval world to an end and opened the path toward the modern age. Thank you for joining this journey through one of history's most defining catastrophes, the bubonic plague of the 1300s.